What do you call a guy who hangs out with musicians? A drummer. In this video, we're going to be looking at two of the greatest drumming films, or films about drummers, of all time. Unsurprisingly, up first we've got Damien Chazelle's Whiplash. It's a slick, high-energy film about the determination needed to reach the top and the cost of getting there. The other film I've chosen to compare this to is The Sound of Metal. It's a really emotional and raw film, touches on a load of themes and kind of uses music to explore themes of loss and also addiction. We're going to compare both of these films, and then at the end I'm going to try and make a judgment as to which one I personally think is best. As always with these videos, I'm going to give a quick spoiler warning. I'm not going to go through the plots in loads and loads of detail, that's not really the point. There are loads of films that kind of focus on like music and bands, and often I think the drummer is kind of like the comedic character. School of Rock's a great example. Alan Parker's The Commitment is another one if anyone's seen that. The drummer in that is sort of absolutely off his head, a really funny character. Whereas these films are focusing on the drummer. They're a lot more emotionally raw and they deal with them as sort of interesting three-dimensional people. Whiplash is Damien Chazelle's 2014 slick, stylized masterpiece. It focuses on the pursuit of perfection and asks us what we're prepared to sacrifice and endure to get there. It kind of uses music and drumming specifically as a vehicle to explore this. The film follows Andrew Neiman, excellently played by Miles Teller, as he joins a really elite music school, and it's about the relationship with his essentially abusive teacher and whether it's worth going through this abuse in order to reach the top and become, one of the all-time greats. This is a really intense film, both due to the sort of outburst of Fletcher, who's brilliantly played by J.K. Simmons. Interestingly, Andrew kind of also puts himself through this struggle. There's loads of scenes where there's loads of visual metaphors of him sort of like playing the drums and then bleeding on his hands and putting a plaster over and keep going, and we see the kind of struggles that he puts himself through in order to try and become one of these really great drummers. The film uses this abuse to ask, is mediocrity and happiness better than going through this sort of suffering and pain in order to pursue excellence, which we've got no guarantee that we're going to get to. Whilst many people think that the film is ambiguous, I do have an opinion about what I think the statement is, which I'll touch upon later. Whiplash is excellent at bringing into this world that most of us, I would imagine, haven't experienced. It plays with tension and pace really well, and the music scenes are absolutely brilliant. I think you can tell both of these actors are very musical. Miles Teller was a very good drummer until he was a certain age and sort of brushed it up for the film, and J.K. Simmons has got a musical degree, and like I said, I really think this shines through. It's not a particularly original thought to say this is a modern masterpiece and a film I would definitely recommend. While still well received, I think Darius Marder's Sound of Metal is slightly less renowned, but definitely worth looking at. It's an absolutely brilliant film and one I'm really looking forward to talking about. Interestingly, this is Marder's only directed film. He's edited a few documentaries and interestingly was a co-writer on Place Beyond the Pines. If anyone hasn't seen that, personally I think that's a brilliant film. The narrative is a really interesting way. It's kind of about one thing for a bit and then completely switches to being about another story and then completely switches to being about another story. They are interlinked and it's about the knock-on effect and fathers and sons and generational trauma perhaps. It's a really interesting film. If The Sound of Metal is anything to go by, we'd really love to see more from Marder. I think it's a brilliant film. I love Place Beyond the Pines and I'm really hoping he's able to bring out some more films shortly. So in this film we follow Ruben Stone, who's brilliantly played by Riz Ahmed. He's an ex-addict and in like the first scene of the film he loses his hearing. He's a drummer in a band with his girlfriend. They live in their van, so not particularly successful, but they're making a living. And it's kind of this sort of relationship with his girlfriend and his music that keeps him clean. And then the film is about his kind of struggle to stay clean. He goes to a sort of retreat for deaf addicts, which is a really interesting interplay, I think. It's a really raw, emotional film, much more of a slow burn than Whiplash, and very much a character study about Ruben. Again, not a particularly original thought, but the sound design in this film is absolutely brilliant, rather than say the music specifically like Whiplash. It really puts us in the shoes of Ruben, but it does this really well. I think a lot of films maybe could have just been like, he's deaf, I'm going to cut the sound, but we get lots of static. It jumps between being from his perspective where we can't hear very well and then jumping back so we get perspective from like his girlfriend, so we are still able to follow the story rather than it just be almost maybe like a gimmicky way of telling the story of he's deaf so we're not going to hear anything. And they don't subtitle the sign language as well. We really put in his shoes, especially in scenes where he doesn't know what's going on because he doesn't speak sign language. The film is less specifically about drumming and music. It's more about what happens when we lose what we love. So for him that is the music. He also in turn loses his girlfriend and struggles with his addiction through this. Personally, this is the best portrayal of addiction I've ever seen in a film. Normally I think films have like a tendency to sort of be about the substance. This person's an alcoholic, so the film's about alcohol, or this person's addicted to heroin, so this film's about heroin. This really gets to the sort of crux of what it's like to be an addict, to have that illness, those personality traits. So it's really interesting in that way. The only other film I can think that maybe gets near to that is Beautiful Boy. If anyone's seen that, absolutely brilliant. But that's maybe a little bit more from like the father's perspective rather than the actual addict. And the only other depiction I can think like this that really sort of grapples with this is Christopher Moltisanti Santi in The Sopranos, if anybody's watched that, which I watched recently. I should have watched years ago, and there's another brilliant portrayal of this, but in film I really think Sound of Metal is above anything else I've ever seen. I'd love to hear if there are any other films that you think portray addiction this well though. Get them in the comments, because I'd love to see them. This is a topic I'm really interested in. Overall, Sound of Metal is a brilliant exploration of loss and addiction, but will it hold up against Chazelle's fiery debut? Let's find out. So on the surface, the most obvious comparison I guess is that Whiplash really is about the pursuit of excellence. These characters are at the top, I guess, and Neiman wants to be one of the great drummers ever. Whereas Sound of Metal is more about the sort of the dirge, the bottom, when everything's been like stripped away, and really delves into those sorts of struggles. There's different approaches to music in both films. It's very much about form versus expression. Whiplash is very much about formal flawlessness, and there's constant reference to charts. Andrew almost gets annoyed when someone asks, isn't who wins a music competition a subjective decision? Whereas Sound of Metal is much more about expression. It's kind of like a life force. It's a way of life for Ruben and his girlfriend. I think that these approaches to music really sort of shape the film then. Whiplash's sort of formal excellence is mirrored in the film itself. A constant like whip pans, really sort of hard cuts on beats of music, and it is so slick. You can really, like I said earlier, see how this is a precursor to La La Land in that sort of formal sharpness. Sound of Metal doesn't really compete when it comes to the music sequences, but it doesn't really try to. Like I've mentioned, it's got this sort of excellent sound design, and the sort of grunge rock that I think they call Black Gammon Play, the band that they're in, kind of becomes part of this like dirgy sound design, which has a lot of static in it, rather than the polished tracks of Whiplash. But like I've mentioned, it doesn't lazily just go quiet, and it's really interesting to see the switches between being from Ruben's perspective and being from the other characters. Rightly so, Sound of Metal won an Oscar for Best Sound, and that's a really huge part of the film, which is really excellent. Interestingly, Whiplash won Best Sound Mixing, but not Editing. These categories were combined in 2020, so we can't really compare this award, but I think the way I would look at it is that from a musical perspective, Whiplash is very much the better of the two. Sound of Metal is very much about the sound and the sound design. Again, maybe not the most original thought, but that's what I think about the two. When it comes to the cast, the leads in both films are absolutely brilliant. Miles Teller's desperation to be perfect is sort of seen almost in every scene. And Riz Ahmed in this role as a like sort of struggling man, constantly on the edge of breakdown, is really heart-wrenching, especially when we sort of see him go back to his addictive tendencies. Even if he's not taking drugs or drinking, he exhibits like behaviours that are of an addict, and again I think that's part of what makes this film so excellent. It treats addiction as an illness and a personality trait and a way of behaving, rather than just I'm a heroin addict, I want heroin, which is far too simplistic for such a complex topic, and Sound of Metal handles this really, really well. I think there's a bit more depth to Ahmed. There are different moments, like I said, he's acting like an addict, he's missing his girlfriend, there's much more going on. I don't think I'd call Teller's one-dimensional or anything like that, and maybe because of the nature of Chazelle's script, I don't think there's quite the space for him to explore this much, and what Teller does do is absolutely brilliant in this film. I'm not for a second degrading that. I just think Riz Ahmed maybe pips it with a little bit more to his character. The supporting roles in both of these films are absolutely brilliant as well. I mean, I don't need to talk about how excellent J.K. Simmons is in this film. This might be the most committed I've ever seen an actor to a role, and I think most people would agree. Famously picked up Best Supporting Actor for this, and I can't think of anyone that's ever been more deserving of that award. Comment below if you disagree, but I don't think many people will do. I'm sure everyone knows this story, so I won't go on about it for too long, but the year before, in 2013, Chazelle actually directed a short film of Whiplash, and it's essentially a sort of proof of concept, and it's that famous scene where he's asking, are you on my time? Are you in pitch? I won't do the shouting. It's really interesting to watch. I think it shows how committed Simmons is, that he's prepared to go and be in this short as well as being in the main film. I think it also shines a light on what Teller adds. Maybe it's because I've watched the actual film, so it doesn't quite fit watching someone else play this role, and even though Johnny Simmons is good, I just don't quite think he delivers the same sort of terror and devastation that Teller does. One thing that's also interesting to compare quickly is the setting. One thing that struck me when I watched the short, it's in like a white-walled classroom here, which I don't think has the same sort of claustrophobia and tension that we get in the actual film. I did a bit of reading on this, and Chazelle actually asked the set designer specifically for these kind of heavy colours. He cited wanting mustards, hunter greens, oxblood, that kind of thing. And he showed the set team a lot of references from like 1970s films, namely The Godfather, which are very dark and I guess moody, and this really adds to the tension of the film. The main supporting actor in Sound of Metal is Paul Ratchie. He plays Joe, an ex-alcoholic who lost his hearing in Vietnam and just shines. He's absolutely excellent in this film, and again, much more subtle than the main support in Whiplash, but an excellent performer nonetheless. Especially in a scene when Ruben comes back, asks for money, and he tells him, you're behaving like an addict, and and says, we can't have you here. And we can tell that he's heartbroken by this, but he kicks Ruben out of the commune, I guess, or retreat where he's staying. Interestingly, this actor was a sort of hearing child to deaf parents, so he's fluent in sign language, and he was in the army. Maybe this adds to the realism of the performance, maybe it adds to the emotional rawness, or maybe it is just an excellent performance from Ratchie, but I think this is a really, really brilliant performance that's definitely gone under the radar, especially if we compare it to Simmons in Whiplash. He did get nominated for Best Supporting Actor, but didn't win. He lost out to Daniel Kaluuya in Judas and the Black Messiah. I haven't actually seen that film, so if you could let me know in the comments if you think that's fair or not, I'd be really interested to hear, and I probably should go and watch that before I talk about it at all. I think one of the main differences, if we're going to compare these films, is the statements they make. I mentioned earlier that Whiplash asks us whether sort of mediocrity and happiness is better than the struggle and the pain and the sacrifice that's often required in pursuing excellence, even if we're not necessarily going to make it there. Whilst many people think this film's ambiguous in its statement, I do think there's a statement here, and I'll touch on that now. If you Google it, there's loads of debate, people from both sides, but ultimately, I think yes, I think the film says it is worth it. It shows us all this awful abuse that they go through. It even spends some time talking about an old student of Fletcher's committing suicide. But in that final scene, the climax, and for anyone that's seen the film, it's a brilliant long sequence. The studio actually tried to get Chazelle to cut it down, and he just outright refused, and thank God he did, because it's such an excellent sort of final 5-10 minutes of the film. Right at the end of that, when he takes over the band and starts kind of running it from behind the drum kit, we see this sort of smile from him, and it's almost as if Fletcher kind of acknowledges his brilliance. I think that the sort of look between them here and Andrew's happiness suggests that for this moment at least, it was worth it for these characters. And so I think the film maybe suggests that it is worth it to go through all of this if we want to be excellent. And that's just my thoughts, though. I'd love to hear from anyone that disagrees with me. Even saying it out loud now, maybe I'm not 100% sure, but when I finished the film, that's what I thought, and I think that's because Chazelle chooses to climax the film there. Sound of Metal isn't really about that pursuit of perfection. It's more about that sort of yearning for something else, for something more that's so intrinsically linked with being an addict. Ultimately, in its much more stripped back but equally excellent ending, it illustrates the importance of sort of peace, of calmness, and of stillness, which Ruben's been reaching for throughout the film as he tries to reach to get his hearing back. There's an interesting moment earlier on where this is kind of signposted, where Joe mentions to him that kind of stillness, that calm, that's the kingdom of God, is his phrase he uses as a religious man, I'm guessing. So very much Sound of Metal is about trying to find that stillness, that calm, that centeredness, rather than sort of pursuing something external to find, I guess, a sense of peace and a sense of fulfillment. So now I've got the difficult job of trying to pick between these two films. Technically, I think they're both excellent. Whiplash maybe pips it. Maybe I'm being influenced by knowing what comes later in Chazelle's career. I'm a huge fan of La La Land, and that's what immediately comes after this film. I guess from maybe a thematic and probably emotional perspective, for me, Sound of Metal is so powerful. Whiplash takes emotions to the extreme. We do see some really extreme emotions, and I think that's what people really praise the film for, as well as its technical excellence. Sound of Metal is so raw, it really struck a chord with me with its these ideas I've spoken about trying to find stillness or on exploring addiction and recovery. So for me, that kind of pips Whiplash, which, as brilliantly as it does this, it just kind of takes emotions to the extreme in order to explore its theme of pursuing excellence and the struggle that is potentially required to get there. In terms of trying to choose which of these films is the best drumming film overall, I think most people would say Whiplash. At least that's the vibe I get from the reception of both of these films, and I'm not sure why. I think objectively I'd probably have to agree. Maybe it's because of the technical excellence of the film, I'm not quite sure, but Sound of Metal was so powerful on a personal level for me. To be honest, it did mean a lot to me as a film. I thought it was really brilliant. If I'm honest, I really can't decide. I know maybe that's a bit of a cop-out, and if you do want to watch a video where I definitely make a decision, then this link up here's got one I made about wrestling.